So my name is Anne Alsina. I am here today with my research partner, Alice Kokar, and today we'll be talking about COVID-19 and families. This is a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today in this presentation. So to begin, our research topic investigates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on families, precisely on individual family members and on interpersonal relationship between those family members. We chose this topic because both Alice and I were living at home during the pandemic and bonded over some of the shared experiences that we had. And with that in mind, we were wondering how others have been coping with the lockdowns and being in close quarters with their family members. So why does this research matter? Well, it matters because this is an ongoing issue. Therefore, the research is limited, but also ongoing. So there's always more information that can come out. It is also essential to understanding how families respond to pandemics and how to prevent negative impacts associated with this. So now we're going to move on to existing information and research. We have divided it into 3 themes, one being parenthood demands, mental health issues in families, and communication and connection. For parenthood demands, the pandemic caused parents to have a heightened level of stress. According to a study conducted by Statistics Canada, 70% of the participants were concerned about balancing childcare, schooling, and work. And in that same study, almost 2 in 3 parents were very or extremely concerned about managing their children's behaviors, stress level, anxiety, and emotions. And almost half of parents were very or extremely concerned about having less patience, raising their voice, and scolding or yelling at the children. So this really indicates that parents were worried about how the children are coping, but also their own abilities to manage stress while parenting. There were some nuances between motherhood and fatherhood. So because of parenting attitudes that are heavily influenced by traditional gender roles, mothers seem to have struggled the most during the pandemic because they were the ones who were expected to take care of the home and of the children. And so they experience a heightened level of stress. Fathers, on the other hand, because many of them were usually less active in the raising of the children, when they were when they were forced to be at home with their kids, that gave them a chance to connect and bond with the children. So there seems to have been a more positive effect on the fathers as they were home with their families.
So the next theme that we studied was mental health in families during the COVID-19 pandemic. Research has shown that the pandemic has had a huge effect on families' mental health, that being an extremely negative one. The increase of restrictions, isolation, and uncertainty have been sources of considerable suffering for parents and children. A reduction of communal activities as well as outside support left parents having to take on the roles of multiple different people in order to help their families. Parents had to help their kids navigate their emotions as they grieved the loss of their old lives that was no longer present. Parents had to deal with the grieving themselves as many felt cut off from the outer world and the activities that used to help them during their day-to-day lives. Studies have found that families have experienced the highest levels of mental stress were those that lived in high-risk areas. Families living in low-risk areas that had low death rates throughout the pandemic dealt with less stress. Another contributing factor to the levels of stress felt by different families were what families had access to help them in terms of tools. Upper-class families had access to employment security, financial security, and food security, which allowed them to better cope with the pandemic's difficulties. Lower-class families who did not have access to as many tools and benefits struggled significantly more to survive throughout the pandemic. The last theme that we looked at was the connection and communication in families during the COVID-19 pandemic. So due to the closeness created by the homebound isolation of the pandemic, many negative things arose in families, such as conflict and issue with communication. Some problems that had been ignored in families for a long time before the pandemic became impossible to ignore during the time of isolation and caused families to grow apart or even break apart. On the other hand, certain families benefited from the increased time spent together as it allowed them to get to know each other better and improve communication. Research and studies have shown that mother-daughter relationships have benefited the most out of all the different familial relationships during this time. Studies have shown that spending time together and doing activities allowed families to create positive experiences during such a negative time. Activities that have proven to have helped include watching movies together, spending time together playing with pets, and just plainly engaging positively with each other. Creating these positive experiences in such a negative time is what has really helped families survive. This approach of turning something negative into something positive is something widely known as CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, and is an effective therapy implemented by psychologists everywhere to help people fight off depression and anxiety. While doing our research and starting our research project, we had a couple of research questions that we aimed to find the answers to and to figure out. So the first one was, how have the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic affected familial relationships and well-being? The second question was, how have the conditions of the events of the COVID-19 pandemic affected individuals in relationship to their families? The third question is, how have families coped with the difficulties and stresses of the COVID-19 pandemic? And finally, has the pandemic had an overall positive or negative effect or effects on families? Okay.
And now moving on to interview findings. For our expert interview, we interviewed a former family lawyer who now practices as a child protection lawyer. He has been in family law for about 2 to 3 years, meaning that he was dealing with families prior to and during the pandemic. Some of the major findings that we saw in this interview is that one, there was a rise in familial conflicts. Prior to the pandemic, divorces were already high. It was estimated that about 50% of marriages end in divorce. Once the pandemic started, there was a significant increase in family-related files and law firms, so much so that law firms were actively hiring more family lawyers, sometimes even just to focus on specific parts such as divorces, custody battles, division of property. Two, external factors such as work and school acted as a distraction. So prior to the pandemic, we were busy, we were going to work, going to school, we had our other outings and errands outside of the home. Once the pandemic happened and we had to be locked indoors and close quarters with other family members, we had no choice but to face each other and to question whether or not we are truly okay with the way our relationships are going. Three, from a family lawyer's perspective, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on familial relationship was overall negative. This is supported by the increase in divorces and domestic violence, showcasing that the pandemic negatively affected spousal relationships within families. Four, there were still some positive impacts on individual family members. So while there was some deterioration between familial relationship, individual members in that family were still able to take a moment to reflect on their lives and decide where they want to go, maybe change their path, maybe pick up a new hobby or find new interests or change their career. And so these are all positive impacts on the individuals within that family. Five, the pandemic increased whatever stage your familiar relationships were in prior to the pandemic. So if before the pandemic, you had a lot of conflict in your family, then this was likely exacerbated during the pandemic. But if before that you and your family had good bonds and good communication, this only increased during the pandemic. It is also important to keep in mind that in the context of family law, when people seek out a lawyer, it indicates that there is conflict. Therefore, the findings of the interview are majoritarily negative in terms of familiar relationships.
The next part of our research project was our focus group. So our focus group comprised of 5 participants, one of which was a parent and the other 4 which were non-parents. They were students that had lived at home for a period of time during the pandemic. With this focus group, we aimed to try and understand people's experiences living at home with family during the pandemic. All focus group participants mentioned suffering with their mental health during the pandemic. Participants expressed experiencing increased symptoms of depression and anxiety due to all of the isolation, as well as all of the uncertainty and instability the pandemic had created in the world around them and in their families. Overall, participants, excluding the parent participant, expressed that they grew closer to their siblings during the pandemic over their parents. The development of positive familial relationships helped individuals overcome feelings of loneliness, sadness, and isolation, overall positively affecting their mental well-being. It is also noted that participants that had a somewhat close and overall smooth relationship with their parents before the pandemic were able to grow closer to them during the time that they spent in isolation. Turning the negative event of the pandemic and isolation into opportunities to connect with the family and do activities together helped individuals cope the most. Out of all the sorts of activities, walks and exercise were mentioned to be the most effective methods of coping. Other notable activities included watching movies together, doing crafts together, working on projects and goals, and overall helped in reducing stress in individuals and families. From all of the information that has been gathered throughout the research project, we have come to multiple conclusions about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on families and familial relationships. Firstly, it is very clear that the pandemic has exacerbated whatever families were already dealing with before the pandemic began. Families that were experiencing difficulties prior to the pandemic encountered more conflict throughout it, causing them to break up and drift away from each other. And families that had overall positive relationships before the pandemic benefited from increased time spent together at home during lockdowns and stay-at-home orders. Time spent at home doing enjoyable activities allowed individuals to bond and connect, further strengthening familial bonds. It has helped in countering the negative effects of stress on individual family members' well-being. So far, there has been an increase in divorces and separation throughout the pandemic, but it does not mean that the majority of families have separated during this time. Some research shows that more families have been separating, other research shows that more families have been growing closer. As we know, the pandemic is ongoing, and so far the answer to whether this has been an overall positive or negative experience depends on a number of factors, including financial security, economic security, levels of income, as well as areas of residence. Overall, we have been able to conclude that families with higher levels of income and security who live in low-risk zones have had smoother sailing throughout the time of the pandemic, as opposed to families with lower income, families with essential workers, and/or families living in really high-risk zones. Further areas of potential study in this field could continue looking into how the ongoing events of the pandemic have affected people of different races, sexes, ages, and social classes. Lastly, this research has found that the Canadian government needs to focus on improving health communication about the pandemic and COVID-19. Families and individuals have suffered considerably due to being unable to access or understand the information that has been spread from the government during this time. In the future, the government should improve their tactics for communication and relaying any information surrounding pandemics or health crises in the future. Clearer and more effective methods of conveying information are needed and need to be implemented. And with that, we're gonna essentially thank everyone for listening to our presentation. We wish you all a nice day and good luck with all the other assignments that you guys have to grade and have to reflect on. So bye everyone.